Welcome to this webinar. There's still a few people joining by the look of it, so I shall just waffle a little bit for a second or two, just to let the people join in, log in properly. So just to make sure that you're all at the right webinar, I think the title was actually put down as "No More Empty Claims," and that's quite true. We're going to be looking at this standard that you can see on the screen in front of you, PAS 2060, and a little bit later on about a standard, an up-and-coming standard that hopefully will move on a little bit from PAS 2060 and might ultimately replace it. So I think everybody that seemed to be joining, oh no, still somebody else coming in, so I'll just hang on another second or two. I think that's everybody in. Right, so welcome. My name is Richard Walsh. I'm NQA's Principal Assessor for Energy and Environment, and quite a large part of my job is to provide training and information both to our own staff, our assessors, and also to clients, and indeed anybody that might want to listen to me around areas in my sector, which covers sustainability, environment, and energy. So that's me, Richard Walsh. You will see a little bit in a short while. There will be, I think there's a picture crops up of me. As I always say, there's a couple of slides at the start that I'm obliged by our training department to show you. That just shows you a little bit about who we are if you've not come across NQA before. So we are a world-leading certification body with operations in a number of places around the world. And I'm not going to read them out, but you can see there that we do lead the way in a number of sectors, in a number of parts of the world. And again, we specialise not just in management system certification, but increasingly offer training and awareness on a number of sectors, as you can see on the slide in front of you. And just a quick idea of the type and some of the clients that we currently work with. So that's me. I've been at NQA now for 16 years. Previously worked for a charity, an environmental charity called Groundwork, and I was at Groundwork looking after their environmental business services side for about 12 years. So I've been working environmentally since the sort of early to mid 1990s, really when ISO 14001 started to become prevalent, and its predecessor BS 7750 back in about 94. So I'm now, as I say there, the Principal Assessor, and that's part of my role to lead and develop technical knowledge of NQA staff and assessors, and also present things like we're doing today. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. I always say I aim to talk for about 45 minutes. If you've sat through a webinar before, you'll know that's probably a bit of an underestimate, but we'll see how we go. If you have any questions, anything that you want to ask as we go along, you should have a panel that's opened up on the screen. If you want to type any questions as we go along into the question box, that's, I'm guessing, the logical place to put them, then please type them in there, and we'll either answer them as we go along, or I'll save them to the end if I feel it's more appropriate to do. So sometimes we end up with going through some of the questions at the end, and then if we do run over slightly, if people then need to disappear, at least we've covered all of the slides I was going to cover. So there is a slot at the end if there's any outstanding questions and indeed answers. Also, to save you frantically trying to scribble down everything I'm saying, then we do, everybody who signed up for the webinar, including those who haven't attended, will be sent a recording of the webinar and also a PDF copy of the slides that are being shown. So you will get a copy probably what day? Well, it's Thursday at the moment, so probably early next week we will be sending out to you all a recording of this webinar and a link to our YouTube channel where you can also see or listen to and see any of the previous webinars that I and indeed many of my colleagues have have delivered over the years. So I think that's that one. Let's just move on. So what we're going to do. So obviously we're going to have a look at carbon neutrality. We're going to look at how PAS 2060 takes us through that, and also how PAS 2060 ensures that we're not greenwashing, that there is a defined logical approach being taken, and that we can rely, or other people can rely on the claims that we're making. We'll look at the basic principles of the standard, what the standard requires. We'll look at the key stages as we go through the implementation of that standard and what it might entail, and obviously a bit of time at the end for questions. So hopefully by the end of today, I apologise if some of this might be old hat to some of you, but we always assume, or I always assume when I'm doing these presentations, that nobody knows anything, and we can start at the beginning, and that way we all hopefully by the end have understood what's being covered. So we'll understand what's meant by carbon neutrality, look at the background to carbon reductions, why we're doing this in the first place, although I guess we can probably all guess. Look at a little bit of the development of the standard PAS 2060, what it means, what are the benefits, why we should do it, look at the different scopes of carbon emissions. You will be surprised, or may not be surprised, to find that sometimes when I'm doing verifications against this standard, or also verifying people's carbon emissions, that people do get them wrong. They put the wrong types of emissions under the wrong scope. So we will just explain those, and again look at the stages of the process. So again, don't forget, any questions that you might have, just shout out, type something in the question box as we go along. So what is carbon neutrality? That's the first thing, really. I find that there's a little bit of confusion sometimes. There's lots and lots of terms and technologies bandied about by people. Sometimes they get it right, sometimes they get it wrong. They say one thing and they actually mean something else, and it must be confusing. Sometimes it's confusing for those people who like to think we know what we're talking about. So carbon neutrality, generally taken to mean a state of balance between the carbon emitted into the atmosphere and the carbon removed from the atmosphere. So in other words, it's a balance. And an organisation that's deemed to be carbon neutral is in that state of balance, a bit like sitting on a seesaw, and you've got this same weight on either side of the pivot. So it's a state of balance, and an organisation is still emitting carbon into the atmosphere, but at the same time is removing a similar amount. At zero carbon, which in my mind is an impossibility, is no carbon emissions are being produced at all. We talk about net zero, and we'll look at net zero shortly. Net zero is not the same as zero or absolute zero carbon, and then occasionally now you get people who claim to be carbon negative. So that's reducing the carbon footprint to less than neutral. So there's a net effect of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere rather than simply adding to it. So therefore, it might be through offsetting, it might be through other schemes that they're involved in, but an organisation is removing more carbon than they're actually emitting themselves. So the carbon trust definition of carbon neutrality. Carbon neutrality has a minimum requirement of covering scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, with scope 3 encouraged, and that's where the Carbon Trust would define that. That's taken from their website. When we look at net zero, which is what the next slide is going to talk about, net zero must cover all of the 3 scopes. So net zero, the current definition, and again, I'm tempted to say that's this week's definition. It does change a little bit sometimes, and I think that's sometimes the confusion, that these things are a little bit fluid, and who knows what's ultimately going to come out of COP28 currently going on out in the Middle East, in Dubai. So that may even change things. I hope not. But net zero's current definition. So there is a project known as the Science Based Targets Initiative. And they've defined net zero targets for corporate organisations as follows. To reach a state of net zero emissions for companies implies two conditions. So reducing scopes 1, 2, and 3, so reducing all of the emissions to zero or to a residual level that is consistent with reaching net zero emissions at the global or sector level in eligible 1.5 degrees centigrade aligned pathways. So what that means, let's try and cut through some of that jargon. What that means is the SBTI, Science-Based Targets Initiative, has set a number of targets on a sector by sector basis. And these targets are where each sector needs to get to collectively to make sure that the warming of the environment doesn't exceed 1.5 degrees. That is a target that we're probably not likely to hit, but that is something that is being aspired to. Now, those targets are not absolute zero. Those targets might be a 20%, sorry, an 80% reduction, leaving you with a net sort of 20%. They different sectors have different residual targets, and the idea being that when you get to your residual level, that might be 20% of maybe where you are on a baseline. That is then when the offsetting comes in to neutralize, if you like, the residual emissions. And that's what it says there. So neutralizing any residual emissions at the net zero target year and any greenhouse gas emissions released into the atmosphere thereafter. So it's accepted that you'll never get to, it's very, very difficult to get below that net zero target, and therefore moving on from there, there would then need to be an element of offsetting using bona fide offsets, and we'll look at that a little bit later on. So why carbon neutrality? This is old hat a little bit now. This is something that we all are aware of. To solve the problem of man-made emissions and their effects on climate change. So in order to solve that problem, we need to take account of our own carbon emissions and make a continued effort to reduce them. If anybody is with us today that was at the last of these presentations, I did this well, exactly 3 months ago on the 7th of September. I got into a little bit of an argument with one of the delegates who took issue with something I said, so I ain't going to say it this time. So in other words, man-made emissions and their effects on climate change. As we've said, it's impossible to reduce our carbon emissions to zero, no matter how hard we try. And carbon neutrality allows the closing of this gap by the purchasing of, and I'll use the term, high quality carbon offsets. So again, we'll quickly whiz through these because again, it's fairly standard stuff. So there's many changes over the Earth's history. 18,000 years ago, we were in an ice age, and up to the last sort of 150 years, probably 150 years now, if not a bit more, climate changes in the Earth's climate have been entirely natural. And the current changes are mainly as a result of increasing human population and associated activities. I'll be careful what I say because I don't want to get myself into trouble, but I think the view is that climate is changing. It still has natural cycles. However, the current changes in climate are predominantly as a result of man-made carbon emissions. And as I've sort of worked in this sector, as I say, for 30 years now, then we come across 3 different positions that people might hold on climate change. That global warming is not occurring, and so neither is climate change. And I think there are very few people who would actually go along with that, whether people believe in the cause of it, but I think people generally accept that the climate is changing. That global warming and climate change are occurring, but these are natural cyclic events completely unrelated to human activity. And then at the other extreme, global warming is occurring mainly as a result of human activity, and so climate change is also the result of human activity. And I think that's where hopefully most of us sit, and that's certainly where I would sit. and I think I would also, in my personal position, underline the word mainly. As I say, I do still believe that it's a cyclic change, climate, and we are making it far, far worse than the natural cycle would generally have left us with. So scientists attribute the current trend to the use of fossil fuels because releasing carbon into the atmosphere now through the burning of fossil fuels is releasing the stores of carbon that were locked away, sequestered as the term, the technical term, buried millions and millions of years ago. So oil, coal, all the result of organic material, animals, plants, flora and fauna dying, breaking down into the soil, being locked away over millions and millions and millions of years, and we're now digging them up, drilling them, getting them out the ground, and releasing that carbon back into the atmosphere. And it's the addition of this old carbon that is tipping the balance and causing the global warming. So what are the main culprits? We all talk about carbon dioxide, and indeed carbon dioxide is the main culprit. As you can see there from the pie chart, carbon dioxide, fossil fuel, and industrial processes accounts for about 2/3-ish of the emissions, and that's carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels and industrial processes. Carbon dioxide is naturally released, so some of that does come from forestry and other land uses. So every time, for instance, a farmer ploughs the field, carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere. So farming, agriculture, land use, that's also releasing about 11%. And then in the other areas, we've got methane, nitrous oxides, F-gases. So F-gases are what we'd find in our air conditioning units, our chillers, things like that. And then by far the worst gas is sulfur hexafluoride, SF6, found as an insulator in high voltage applications. And you can see on the table at the top how these compare to carbon dioxide. So methane is roughly somewhere between, I've seen various numbers, somewhere between 25 and 30 times as potent as carbon dioxide. And of course, methane is released through man-made emissions, but also can be released naturally as well. And that's part of the issue, that there's a lot of methane locked up in the oceans, and as the oceans warm, that methane tends to be released, and it's almost a self-fulfilling cycle. And as you can see there, the breakdown of the 65% is split into some of those other areas on the pie chart. So just a little bit of background as to where this all might be coming from. So what are we doing about it? What are we doing about it? Now, it's generally accepted that certainly within the UK, we are one of the leading countries in tackling climate change, and certainly the reductions that we are making, whilst many people believe that they're not good enough, and maybe that is a valid point, we are still probably in the top 3 or 4% of countries in terms of how we are managing to reduce our carbon emissions through industry, through commerce, through farming, etc., etc. Excuse me, but we can obviously do more. And in order to move forward as a UK, we set ourselves carbon budgets and we set ourselves carbon reduction targets. And you can see there that the dotted line is going forward into the future and is the UK's recommended net zero pathway. And the black line is the current target and UK emissions. So at the moment, where are we now? Between 2020, so we're probably looking at the UK producing somewhere in the region of about 500 megatons, 500 million tons of carbon equivalent. And that's not just carbon dioxide, of course, that's carbon equivalent on an annual basis. Some time ago now, the current government produced a 10-point plan to get us on track for net zero. Some of this has changed ever so slightly. Some of it has been pushed back a little bit. and I'm not in any way going to get into the politics of any of this. This was just taken from the UK government website. So these are the areas that the government are working on in moving the UK forward to get us on track for net zero. I'm not going to read them out. You can read those at your leisure. And no doubt there are differing views on whether we will meet some of those targets or whether we won't. So, for example, greener maritime jet zero, as it's called. I don't know whether you saw in the news last week. I think it was the first Virgin Atlantic plane across the Atlantic using 100% biofuel. So things are moving forward. So that's just a little bit of a snapshot of what the government thinks it's going to try and achieve. So going forward, we are still at this important inflection point. People are coming together. Obviously, as I say, we're right in the middle of COP28 at the moment. Government, industries, civil society coming together to take climate action. And there is, whatever people might think or believe, there is a growing global consensus around a net zero carbon future. We've got to do something about that. And we've got to try and halve global emissions over the next decade. The problem being, of course, that the things that we did 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, the developing world are just starting to do that now and have a right to do that. So there is a lot of politics, there is a lot of discussion, a lot of ambitions in some parts of the world who, for people who wish to improve their livelihoods, improve their financial performance. But however, as a planet, as a group of people living on this spinning planet, we do need to take action, and we all ultimately have to move faster. And this was a statement made a year or two ago now by Carolyn Fairbairn, who was a past Director General of the CBI. Immediate and decisive action is needed to avoid the catastrophic impacts of climate change and create opportunities in low carbon technologies. One of the biggest issues that we still find is the issue of greenwashing, because people do realise that we've got to do something. People are looking for solutions, and it has become quite obvious over the years that a lot of businesses are jumping on that bandwagon of making spurious claims, making false claims that their products, their services are all counting, are all working towards this sort of net zero future. And greenwashing defined as an attempt to capitalise on the growing demand for environmentally sound products. And of course, that greenwashing can convey a false impression that a company or indeed its products are environmentally sound. But how do we actually prove that? And genuinely green products, genuinely green, environmentally sound businesses back up their claims with proven facts and proven details. And how do we do this? The business NQA is in. We are in the business of management systems. And management systems, be it ISO 9001, which is where a lot of us started many, many years ago, including myself. I started out as an engineer back in the very early 80s with what was BS 5750, the first standard for quality. BS 5750, which became ISO 9001, and the environmental standards, the energy standards, carbon standards have all followed along that. So PAS 2060 is the specification for the demonstration of carbon neutrality, and it specifies set requirements. Requirements have to be met by any entity, and that's the phrase the standard uses. An entity doesn't have to be just a business, by any entity seeking to demonstrate that they are carbon neutral. And that carbon neutrality is demonstrated through quantifying, reducing and offsetting of greenhouse gas emissions from what the standard calls a uniquely identified subject. So the entity is the organisation claiming the carbon neutrality, and the uniquely identified subject, if you like, if we put it back into, say, ISO 9000 or ISO 14000 terminology, the uniquely identified subject is the scope and the boundaries of that plane. The standard came into effect a long time ago. It's not a new standard, is this? It came into effect in April 2010, so that's nearly 14 years ago. And it was reissued 10 years ago. And as you'll see in some slides towards the end, things have moved on a little bit, and it is likely in the next year or two to be superseded. But at the moment, it is still in force, it is still in place, and it is a standard that we're seeing a huge uptake in people wanting to use it to be able to demonstrate that they are effectively and actually carbon neutral. So why might we think about doing it? It helps us demonstrate our environmental, our sustainability, integrity. It provides clear and credible messages that will allow customers to be able to trust the messages that we're giving as businesses. It helps us get onto, not just jump on a bandwagon, but it helps us actually meet increasing customer demand for an environmentally friendly product or service. Internally within our businesses, if our staff see that we're doing something, we're serious about it, and we want to prove that we're serious about it, it helps engage and motivate our own staff and stakeholders, be they customers, be they clients, be they shareholders, be they suppliers. It helps motivate everybody connected with our organisation. And also, as I always say, working sustainably is a good, effective, efficient way of working. Reducing waste, using materials more effectively, circular economy, everything's working towards our businesses becoming more sustainable, but more, I guess, cost effective. And ultimately, more than anything else, allows external people to differentiate our business, our organisation from the competition. And by doing that, if people can see that we're serious about this and we're demonstrably serious about this, hopefully that will sway them to come and buy, to come and work with us and increase our revenue and indeed our market share. So what does the standard look like? The way we tend to look at it, there are 4 basic principles set within PAS 2060. So it sets measurement and reduction targets for any organisation, and it allows for a specific carbon neutrality statement ultimately to be fully verified, and external verification is one of the pathways to be able to do this. And we'll talk now through what these basic principles might entail. So I've alluded to this first slide before, so this is talking a little bit about who or what can be certified. So the entity shall, in its determination of the subject, uniquely identify itself. Who are you? What is it? What's the business name? What's the site that we're talking about? Is it an address? Is it a site? Is it a process? Whatever it is, we need to uniquely identify what it is that we're claiming to be carbon neutral. We need to make sure that we've established and understood all of the characteristics of that entity. So what's its purpose? What are the objectives? How does it function? And then make sure that we establish and take into consideration everything associated with the running, the delivery, the management of that subject. Okay. First question. Wow, we've done well. We've got half an hour without a question. I've either bored you to death or you've just woken up. Elizabeth, hi. Does PAS... No, you don't have to say sorry. Does PAS 2060 link to 14001? Is there a preferred pathway between the two? There isn't a formal link, certainly not. 14001 is obviously, as you'll probably be aware, all about improving your impact on the environment. And obviously by managing and ultimately reducing your carbon footprint, the two go hand in hand. but there isn't really preferred pathway. Most of the people, well, I think without exception, everybody that we're working with on PAS 2060 has already got ISO 14001, and what they're doing is using this standard as an additional way of taking carbon management to the next level. So the two work together, but they're not sort of mutually exclusive. And I think that what PAS 2060 does is it builds on one element of our impact on the environment and takes it to a much higher level. Because 14001 doesn't require us to demonstrate carbon footprint. It's something a lot of people do, but it's not at that same level, and we're not making the same commitments to reduce carbon footprint as we would in PAS 2060. There we go. How often would this be recertified? It's annual, Chris. So it's an annual. We'll come on to that. You're asking a question that we're going to come on to, so we'll look at that. Back to Elizabeth. If you don't already have 14,000 when there's an disadvantage to do it first, not at all. Like as I say, they're sort of exclusive. No worries, Chris. You can just do 14,001. I think, as I said, the trend seems to be that people have got 14,001 and then wish to actually concentrate a little bit more on one aspect of their impact on the environment and then look at PAS 2060. It's not a prerequisite of having 14,001. The only advantage might be that you're more used to management systems if you've got an existing standard like 14,000 or 9,001 in place, but no, it wouldn't cause any problems if you started that straight out. Okay, let's move on then. I think we've covered that one. So entities can include public sector, communities, organizations, companies or part of, clubs, social groups, families and individuals. I've never quite seen an individual claim carbon neutrality under PAS 2060, nor have I really seen a family do it. But it is a possibility, and it's a standard that can be used by absolutely anything at all. Anybody that anything you can draw a line around and create a defined entity, if you like. And within those entities, then of course, so no matter what it is, whether it's a public sector, whether it's an organisation, whether it's a company, or whatever it's going to be, we need to then think about the activities of that entity, the products or services that they may supply or produce, the buildings they may own or may manage or inhabit, the type of work they're involved in, the projects, any major developments they're involved in, the events that they might manage, and as I say, and any other developments within that particular entity as things progress, as things change. So almost anything is possible within this standard. So the starting point in all of this, if you're gonna manage something, and it's a fairly general sort of statement, is this, and I would say it holds true for almost everything in life. If you're going to try and manage something, you've got to measure it in the first place. So the starting point for this standard particularly is to calculate the actual carbon footprint for the entity seeking the declaration. So what is our carbon footprint in a defined period of time? And that defined period of time is usually a year. Doesn't have to be a calendar year. Again, companies, organizations I've worked with have set various 12-month periods. Sometimes it's a financial year, sometimes it's an academic year, but it can be any time. We prefer it to be a 12-month period because, of course, that takes in all the different seasons, the different times of year that might affect carbon footprints. Be it sort of retail, where obviously we're bang slap in the middle of a Christmas period where retailing's hopefully going through the roof. It takes into account summer, winter, autumn, spring. A 12-month period is the normal period, and that initial carbon footprint then becomes the baseline. And there's a number of recommended methodologies as detailed by the standard itself. Some of you will have come across ISO 14064. There's a number of parts to 14064. So 14064 Part 1 is how you as an organisation would go about pulling together your carbon footprint. We do that as well. We work with businesses and we verify people's carbon footprints as another arm of the activities that we at NQA undertake. But there's various other. There's the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. There is the National Government Environmental Reporting Protocols here within the UK. There is a set method for producing carbon footprints. DEFRA and, well, they're not called BEIS anymore. The whatever BEIS was, I think they're now the Department for Energy and Energy Security and Climate Change. I think I never remember the name. They keep changing it. They jointly produce a spreadsheet every year. It normally comes out in about May, June time, and those are the defined conversion factors for a particular year in terms of converting kilowatt hours of gas or electricity or diesel, whatever that might be, into kilograms, tons of carbon. There's other things that can be used. PAS 2060, which is a sort of a standard that sits alongside PAS 2060, which is specification for the assessment of the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of goods and services. That can also be used. So there's many, many different ways that this first stage can be done. However, there are a number, whatever method is used, there's a number of pieces of criteria that have to be followed. So footprint measures must include a minimum of 95% of the total calculated emissions. So when this is being worked out, you can exclude emissions that constitute less than 1% of the total. That's to avoid getting bogged down with lots and lots of little insignificant emissions. However, the sum total of all those little bits can't exceed 95%. Sorry, can't exceed 5%. Let me get it right. So the sum total of the little bits, the 1%, less than 1%, mustn't add up collectively to more than 5%. We have to measure and calculate and declare a minimum of 95%. Now, in my mind, in order to exclude something, you've got to have measured it in the first place. So if you've measured it in the first place, you might as well put it in. That's my personal view. I'm sure a lot of us are fully conversant with the scope, but we will just quickly look at them. So scope 1, direct emissions from owned or controlled sources. So scope 1 emissions typically would be emissions from the burning of gas in a central heating or a hot water boiler. Similarly, the use of diesel or oil to produce heat, to produce hot water, the burning of oils and diesel in company vehicles or company plant. If you're in construction, all of the plant that might be on site, diggers and excavators and telehandlers and all that sort of thing, they all burn fuel. If that is a carbon-based fuel, that will all be a scope 1 emission. So it's a direct emission from something that we own or control. Scope 2, indirect emissions from generation of purchased electricity, steam, heating and cooling. The vast majority of scope 2 emissions come from the use of electricity. We plug something into the wall and we're using electricity. Now that electricity has been generated somewhere at a power station, increasingly through also through renewable sources as well, but generally there is a mix. And every year there is a set carbon conversion figure produced for electricity from the grid, and that for most people is their only scope 2 emission. You may, I have a couple of clients who import steam from another site, so you may use steam in your process, and that steam is generated maybe as a byproduct from the plant next door. That would also be a scope 2 emission. Likewise, if you are in a managed premise and the organization that you are renting your business from, maybe they're producing heat or even cooling through maybe a building air handling system or a HVAC system, if they're providing you with heating and cooling, then that would also be a scope 2 emission for you, because those emissions are coming elsewhere. And then scope 3, which for most people is the largest percentage, but also the most troublesome, if you like. All other indirect emissions that occur in an organisation's value chain: waste treatment, purchasing of goods, delivery of those goods, business travel, employee commuting, stays in hotels, flights, rail travel, bus travel, all of that becomes a scope 3 emission. So those are the 3 scopes that we need to think about. So, having then set out what our current carbon footprint is, and got that agreed, got that verified to say that yes, it is, I don't know, 170 tons of carbon in a year, we then have to plan to reduce those identified emissions. The standard requires continual improvement in carbon performance, if you like. So we have to plan to reduce these identified emissions. We need a carbon management plan. And it's a public declaration. We'll come on to what the declarations are, but there's a public declaration made by the organisation, by the entity, that this is what we're going to do. And within that declaration, a timescale for achieving carbon neutrality, specific targets for greenhouse gas reductions. So that might be that we're going to reduce our electricity use by X kilowatt hours a year, which would then produce carbon savings. Might be we're going to we use less gas, less diesel, etc., etc. But also, how are we going to do that? So we might reduce electricity by installing LED lighting. We might have better controls on our systems, etc., etc. So we have to say how we're going to achieve them and justify the techniques and the measures that we're going to be used. And it is possible to take into account historic reductions as well, and to make sure that if we are going back in time, I don't want to get too deep into this because this can be a little bit complicated. You can take into account the previous reductions as well. Tristan, I'm coming on to ISO 14068, so I'll just park that question for now and we'll look at that. There's a couple of slides towards the end where we're covering that. So carbon reduction plan, and the plan must be updated annually. It's continual improvement. The declared reduction, however, can be absolute. So in other words, it's 170 tons this year and it's going to be 165 tons next year. That's an absolute reduction. Or it can be intensity. And what we mean by intensity, you might say it's we would compare maybe carbon emissions with turnover. So for every £1,000 of turnover, we produce, I don't know, let's keep it simple, 50 kilograms of carbon. Next year, we're going to aim for every £1,000 of turnover, we're going to aim for 45 kilograms of carbon. Doing it through the use of intensity does not penalise a growing business. So it can be absolute, it can be intensity. One of the negatives that's been thrown at this standard sometimes is the use of offsetting. So past 2060 requires that the total amount of carbon emissions at the end of a reduction period are offset by high quality certified carbon credits which meets one of the all of the following criteria. So the standard itself sets out the minimum criteria that the offsets have to meet. So at the end of the first year, so it's not in the first year, when you initially seek certification as past 2060, and this is where there has been a little bit of bad press, and I disagree with this entirely. In the first year with the baseline, you offset everything. There have been no reductions made. You've declared your baseline and you fully offset that. As you move forward, and we encourage people to try and follow the reductions set out in the SBTI, the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So we encourage people to follow that track. Every year, your carbon offsetting should get less and less. But by making sure that the offsetting follows one of these, and these bullet points have been lifted directly from the standard, then we can be assured that the offsets are not in themselves greenwash. And believe you me, there are a number of offsets out there that are pure and utter greenwash. So we don't do, looking at bullet point 3, we don't do the verification of the offsets themselves. That is quite a technical job and not something that we do, but the offsets that are being used have to be verified by an independent third party, and you can buy verified offsets. And again, just a list of some of the ones. Again, this is taken directly from the standard. There's other ones out there now as well, but these are the types of offsets that people are looking at using. A lot of people use the United Nations offsetting register. That's proving quite a popular one for people to use at the moment. And again, they are all valid. And one of the things we do as part of the assessment process, before you go out and spend a lot of money on offsets, we do sort of sit down and have a look at what you are intending to buy to make sure that you're not wasting money. Just to give an idea, again, this is just a little bit of background information, and time's pushing on, so I won't go through all of these in detail, but just gives you some idea of the types of amounts of CO2 that are produced by various areas of business and various types of travel. And then the final stage of the whole process is the documentation, the verification, and the declaration of being carbon neutral. And this is done through what's called a qualifying explanatory statement. If you go online and type into Google qualifying explanatory statement, then you will find there are dozens and dozens out there. So you can see what people are producing. It's a publicly available statement. It has to be publicly available. It says there the standard requires public disclosure. Not just of the statement itself, but of all the supporting documentation, the carbon management plan, the offsets, etc., etc. And that's what the next slide will state. So proof of emissions reductions, the withdrawal of the offsetting credits, the carbon footprint report, the carbon management plan, all of that's contained in the qualifying explanatory statement, the QES. And the requirement to provide all of this information publicly is fundamental to the final and ultimate validation of carbon neutrality status. Okay, Steve, that's quite a complex question, which we'll come back to towards the end, if you don't mind me just parking that for 10 or 15 minutes. Now, validation. There are 3 ways that the standard allows validation. In rising, if you like, in rising efforts of assurance, shall I say, self-validation is possible. I'm not a big fan of self-validation. You can actually declare it yourself. You don't have to have anybody come and check it. You can declare. If you've sat on this webinar before, you'll have heard me say this before. If you search for Marks and Spencer's, and if anybody's from overseas, they're a very well-known, very sort of traditionally high-quality UK department store. So Marks and Spencer's self-validate. And if you've seen the advert, I would always say that this just isn't Marks and Spencer's. This isn't carbon neutrality. It's Marks and Spencer's carbon neutrality. And they take the view that why wouldn't you believe us? This is who we are. However, even if you self-validate, there is sufficient information within the QES, within the qualifying explanatory statement, to be able to pick your way through. And if you know what you're looking at, you can sometimes pick holes in self-declaration, self-validation, self-declaration. I'm not a fan of it. I don't think it sort of gets rid of that greenwash, because actually you're just making a claim yourself. You can be validated by a non-accredited organisation. So a consultant who's worked with you can put their name to it. There are people who are offering to do this validation for you. We would argue that the best way forward is to have independent accredited third-party validation. Now, at the moment, there isn't a formal accreditation scheme for third-party validation of this type. UCAS are working on one, and there is a pilot scheme running that we're members of, NQA, that will then produce a UCAS accredited validation for this, just as there would be for any of the other standard management standards. However, what PAS 2060 says is that if as an organisation you are accredited, as we are, as an energy and environmental management certification body, so we're UCAS accredited to offer 14,001 and 50,001 certification, that meets the criteria of being an independent accredited third-party validation for carbon neutrality. So if you like, we're borrowing that accreditation from our existing energy and environmental management certification to allow us to say that we're accredited to do this, but there will be a UCAS scheme fairly soon. So a question that I believe Tristan asked a little bit a while ago now. You may have heard of 14068, ISO 14068. So obviously in the ISO family, anything that's ISO 14000 tends to be environmental. So 14001 starts us off with environmental management, and we work our way through many. The 14060s tend to be related to carbon. So ISO 14068, still under development, is the specification relating to greenhouse gas management and related activities, namely carbon neutrality. That's taken from ISO. It is likely that there will be alignment between the current carbon neutrality specification, if you like, PAS 2060, and the future standard 14068/1, which is the actual, what it's going to be called. A draft version was published in November 2023, a couple of weeks ago now, and it establishes a hierarchy for carbon neutrality, which hasn't really existed before, where greenhouse gas emission reductions and greenhouse gas removal enhancements take priority over offsetting. As I sort of alluded to earlier, for some people, offsetting was seen as an easy way out. So you pay a bit of money, you buy some offsets, and everybody goes away happy, thinking we've done our bit. However, what this standard is doing is trying to address some of those concerns and actually sets a hierarchy for carbon neutrality, whereby the best way, and I think we would all agree the best way, is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, not just pay some money for somebody else to do it. So looking at reductions and removal enhancements within the value chain. So value chain, we're talking about scope 3 emissions, and all of that takes priority over offsetting. But it will also include requirements for carbon neutrality commitments and making claims about carbon neutrality. There are a number of core principles within 14068/1. So again, transparency, very, very important. Public disclosure, just the same as PAS 2060. What the standard is calling conservativeness. So that's assumptions, values, and procedures in place to make sure that the current progress is not overstated. When we're doing carbon verification, when we're looking at carbon neutrality, we err on the side of caution. And if in any doubt, people tend to slightly overestimate. So if any assumptions are being made, we look for the assumptions to be on we've actually produced slightly more carbon than we think we might have. We can't be 100% certain, but we'll actually err on the side of caution and say it's slightly higher than possible. So it's making sure that we're not underestimating our carbon footprint or overestimating the reductions that we're making. I've mentioned the greenhouse gas hierarchy. Now, so reductions, removals within the boundary and value chain, so that's called insetting. Maybe a term you haven't come across before. We know what offsetting is. That's actually buying some credits elsewhere. Insetting is actually making the reductions ourselves. So reductions, insetting, and then offsetting. The standard is all about supporting transition. It's helping businesses make sustainable development moves, set targets, make progress, moving away from this business as usual approach. 14068 will look at this science-based approach. So the reductions that are set will be expected to be based on latest climate science and periodic reviews when making decisions. It's likely that the SBTI targets may be amended, that the rate of reduction may be increased. These are the sorts of things that might come out of sort of the latest COPs, you know, the COP28. And accountability. Ultimate accountability rests with the entity which controls the subject. So in other words, we have to be fully accountable for what we're doing. So just a couple of slides left before I get on to the questions. I'll try and keep it so that we finish the slides within an hour and we're not far off. So what would we think about? So seek accreditation, seek certification. Certification from external bodies will bolster your credibility within the industry. We would say that, of course, being a certification body, but that's what the standard is all about. The gold standard, if you like, within PAS 2060 is the third party, fully independent, accredited certification. Make the most of technology, dashboards, database solutions to find out where your carbon is being emitted, and then use technology where possible to mitigate those carbon emissions. There's got to be leadership from the top. This has to come from the top. Embedding large-scale change in any organisation is only successful if there's buy-in and visible support from senior leadership. Having said that, it's got to be a shared responsibility across the company. It can't just be one person's job. You know, it's not just about having a sustainability department and letting them then get on with it. The analogy I always use is a little bit like a stick of rock, if you're familiar with that from the UK. So a stick of rock, long, sweet, maybe sort of several tens of centimeters long, quite often with words running through it, very cleverly put together. However they make it, I don't know. But wherever you take a slice through that stick of rock, you will see those words running through. So we expect to see sustainability running through the entire organisation. Collaborate with other organisations. It's got to be, if we're going to be looking at scope 3 emissions particularly, talking to suppliers, working with customers, looking at how they can all help reduce your carbon footprint, and ultimately to make sure you're playing your fair part. Set science-based targets. That's the whole reason for doing this. The Science-Based Targets Initiative are setting the targets that we must follow to achieve what we need to do to try and correct this imbalance. So that's sort of an end of where we are. Somebody did ask the question, do NQA supply any specific training? Yes, we do, Richard. If you want to speak to our training department, you will get, when you get the email that sends out the information about the course, if you reply to that or speak to the person who sent that out, yes, we do. If you go onto our website, if you just type nqa.com into a search engine, there is a training area. I think it's nqa.com/training. We do training in all of this. We do specific courses on this particular area. As you can see there, that's just a list of the types of things we do. And if you want to again follow that link, as I say, you will get the slides in a day or two. So I noticed one or two people have already disappeared because we have got to the end of the slides, and I've managed to keep it to exactly an hour to get through the slides. I am just now going to try and address the questions. There's only a couple, I think, that are left. So they tend to be slightly more technical questions, not around the standard itself, but more around working out carbon footprints. So Tristan, I hope I did cover what you were expecting on ISO 14068. There won't be a huge difference, I don't think. What are PAS 2060's advantages? Well, PAS 2060's advantages are that it exists now. 1468 isn't going to be around for another year or two yet. and it's fully expected that if you've got past 2060, it should be a fairly seamless transition across to 14068 as and when that comes out. Obviously, where I think 14068 will have an advantage is that it is a more globally known, it will be a globally known standard. We all understand the 14,000 series standards. At the moment, people sometimes question what is PAS 2060, how does a PAS fit in with an ISO standard, etc., etc. ISO standards tend to be seen as the sort of the highest level, the internationally recognized standards. So that would be, for me, the main advantage over 14068. But in terms of PAS 2060, it's here now. It's been around a long time. It's accepted, and it will set you up for a fairly seamless transition across to 14068 as and when that appears. Steve, I have done a baseline report, and for scope 1 and 2, during my investigation into this, I was told I could claim a 25% reduction in the national grid CO2 figure, as we are using a green tariff with electricity generated from green sources. Why is this only 25% and not more? I'm going to shoot whoever told you that down in flames, because actually it should be zero reduction. There is a huge misconception that just because you've signed up to a green tariff, you can actually claim zero carbon for your electricity. Without getting into too many complicated scenarios, the only way you can claim zero is to be signed up to a certified green energy tariff that is backed by what is known as a REGO. So REGOs are produced by people who generate green electricity. So you might own a wind farm and they generate green electricity. Now the problem is those REGOs can be sold. It stands for Renewable Energy Guarantees of Origin. So for every megawatt hour of electricity I produce from my wind turbine, I then get one REGO. I can use that to supply that energy to somebody, or I can sell that to somebody. So unless your supply is REGO backed, and you can get certificates to show that, if it's REGO backed, you can count it as zero. If it's not REGO backed, it has to be 100%. I don't know where this 25% has come from, and I would vehemently disagree with whoever has told you that. If you want to know a little bit more about that, I'm happy to engage with you outside of this webinar, and I'll give you my email address towards the end. Final one, I think, from Andy. Oh no, a couple more coming up now. So Andy Whalen, which conversion factors should be used when using spend for the measurements of some impacts? The factors you mentioned earlier only include usage, volumes, weights, etc. Again, quite a complicated scenario. When we come on to scope 3 emissions, there are lots and lots of different ways. If you look at the government carbon factors, it's not a spend based, as you quite correctly say. It's usage, it's volumes, it's weights, it's miles, it's kilometers, etc., etc. There are different ways. The Office of National Statistics, the ONS, produce, or they haven't updated it recently, but it's still considered valid. They do produce a guide or a table based on lots and lots of different sectors on carbon emissions per £1,000 spend in that sector. It's a very, very generalized tool, but it is considered acceptable. So it's the Office of National Statistics, and it's their sector by sector carbon footprint verification, if you like. And it goes through dozens and dozens of different sectors, so there's lots and lots of things in there. That's the best answer I can give you in this short time. At scope, Nigel, what if you have a supplier that cannot even estimate their carbon emissions, so you cannot calculate yours? I agree entirely, and we're coming back to my previous answer they gave to Andy. If you obviously know what the supplier is, you know what sector they are in. If they're supplying you with raw material, so let's say they're a steel supplier and they're supplying you with raw material steel, If you use the government carbon factors, it's a very, very detailed spreadsheet. It will give you a carbon figure for every ton of steel supplied, every ton of wood, every ton of concrete, different materials. If you can't go down that route, you can do it by spend, as I've just explained to Andy. Right, after all of that, it was from uk.gov, yes. Right, that's interesting. I would still disagree. If I'm honest, what would be nice actually if you could send me that link, Steve. My email address for those that are left is richard.walsh, that's W-A-L-S-H, richard.walsh at nqa.com, and I'm happy to engage with any of you outside of this this webinar if you have any further questions you wish to ask, but particularly, Steve, if you would care to send me a link to that uk.gov information, I'd be quite happy to cast my eye over it. It's the first I've heard of it. Nobody's ever come back and said that's before. I might have missed it, but yeah, I'd be interested to have a look at that. Right, thanks a lot. Oh, we've done well, kept it to just over an hour and 5 minutes. So thank you very much. As I say, keep in touch. As a reminder, you will get a link to a recording of this webinar, and also you'll get copies of the slides sent out. Any further questions? Last call. Oh no, sorry, carbon independent org. Ooh, yeah, okay, that's starting to be slightly less credible, I would say. But ever so much, thank you, everybody. But Steve, can you just send me that link from carbon independent org, whoever they are? I'd be very interested to just look at that. So I don't think there's any more questions. All the stuff coming through now says thank you, etc., etc. Great. Keep in touch. Give us an email. Tell me what you thought of it. Ask me any other questions, and maybe I'll see you again. There'll be some more webinars done by me on some other standards, with some coming up on another standard, ISO 26000, which is on corporate social responsibility. Watch out for that coming up in the new year. And finally, may I wish you all a very pleasant, very happy Christmas and a new year, and see you all probably sometime again, or maybe hear from you all in the new year. Thanks a lot, best wishes, and that's it really. Thank you.